Ruby Mountains Sheep Range, Nevada, autumn 1905. The wind already had a blade to it, a promise of the iron-hard winter to come. On a windswept bench overlooking a vast, sage-stippled valley, Iñaki Etxeberria was lashing juniper poles together into a shape that made no sense to the men who stopped their wagons to watch. It was not the solid, four-square footprint of a cabin. It was a hexagon, a sprawling spiderweb of wood that looked flimsy and strange against the granite backdrop of the mountains. Garrett Whitmore, the Pendleton wool buyer for the region, reined in his horse, his face a mask of professional skepticism. He was a man who understood value in terms of weight, grade, and staple length. He saw the growing pile of raw, greasy, black-faced fleece near the bizarre wooden frame and shook his head. "Etxeberria," he called out, his voice carrying easily on the thin air. "You pack your clip into a wall like that, it'll be a matted, greasy ruin by spring. I'll have to grade it down 60%. You'll lose your bond season on a fool's notion." A neighboring rancher, a man named Silas Croft, who had built 3 stout log cabins in his time, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice. "It's a crazy sheep pelt tent," he muttered to his companion, loud enough for Iñaki to hear. "The first real blizzard will tear it to scraps and scatter that wool clear to Elko." Iñaki paused. His hands sure as he tightened a rawhide lashing, he looked at the concerned wool buyer and the mocking neighbors, his dark eyes calm. He said nothing. He simply turned back to his work, his movements economical and precise, as if the opinions of other men were no more consequential than the wind whistling through the juniper. He had a different knowledge, born of older mountains half a world away. What did this Basque shepherd builder, this artsena from the Pyrenees, understand about the very fleece he sheared that a professional wool buyer, a man whose entire life was dedicated to the commodity, had missed? What secret of thermal dynamics, held in the crimp and lanolin of a single wool fiber, was about to be demonstrated in the harshest classroom on the continent? The answer wasn't just about shelter. It was about a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between a man, his flock, and the killing cold. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn the startlingly simple physics behind one of the most effective natural insulators on the planet. We'll explore how a structure that looked like a tent could hold a steady 70 degrees in a sub-zero blizzard using almost no fuel. By the end, you'll see the world of insulation in a new way. So subscribe, hit the like button, and let's dig into this incredible story of frontier ingenuity. And tell me in the comments, what's the most unusual building material you've ever heard of? Iñaki Etxeberria was not a logger. He had no feel for the heft of a double-bit axe or the slow, patient logic of a saw cutting through pine. He was not a miner, drawn to the dark and the explosive promise of silver. He was not, in the Nevada sense, a frontiersman. He was an artsena. His hands knew the warm, oily texture of fleece, the smooth, worn wood of a shepherd's crook, the precise tension of shears, and the cold, unyielding reality of stone. In his home province of Vizcaya, he had spent years moving with the flocks into the high meadows of the Aralar Range, wintering in stone huts called sabolas. These were not grand structures. They were simple, semi-subterranean shelters, but their secret lay in the walls, which were often stuffed thick with the culled, dirty wool of the flock. Wool deemed unfit for sale, but perfect for holding back the wind and damp. He had learned that wool's greatest talent wasn't being woven into a blanket. It was simply being left alone, a great, fluffy mass of trapped air. He had brought his wife, Maide, and their 2 young children, Ander and Alara, to the Nevada high country with the promise of land and a vast, open range for their own flock. They had arrived with a small savings and a deep well of determination. But they had not been prepared for the sheer, unrelenting viciousness of a Great Basin winter. Their first cabin, a hastily built affair of thin pine logs, chinked with mud and grass, was a sieve for the cold. It didn't just leak heat, it actively invited the frost inside. That first winter became a benchmark of misery, a collection of sharp, sensory memories that fueled Inyaki's resolve. He remembered the small, round tin of saddle soap Maite kept on a shelf near the door. One morning, with the temperature at 20 below, she had knocked it to the floor. It didn't dent, it shattered like cheap pottery, the frozen soap exploding into a dozen sharp-edged pieces. He remembered the sourdough starter, a living, bubbling thing he had carefully nurtured from their homeland. He kept the jar wrapped in cloth near the stone cellar wall, what should have been the warmest part of the house. By January, it had gone silent. The yeast was not dead, but stunned into a deep hibernation by the pervasive chill that leached through the very stones. Most vividly, he remembered the side of cured beef hanging from a rafter. When he went to slice some for a thin stew, the knife skipped off its surface as if it were granite. He tapped it with a knuckle, and it rang with a dull, mineral sound. It was no longer meat. It was a frozen club. The children, Ander and Alara, slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the dim light of the cabin. Iñaki knew he could not ask his family to survive another winter like that. He would not. The failure of that first cabin was not due to a lack of effort. It was a failure of physics. The conventional wisdom of the frontier, born in the forested, humid lands of the East, was ill-suited for the dry, radiating cold of the high desert. A standard log cabin, for all its romantic, rugged appeal, was a thermal disaster. The logs themselves, even dense pine, offered minimal insulation, an R value of perhaps 1.2 per inch. An 8-inch log wall, therefore, provided an R value of less than 10. This was woefully inadequate when the outside temperature plunged to 30 below zero and the wind scoured every surface. The real problem, the one Iñaki understood intuitively from his stone tixabolas, was thermal bridging. In a square-cornered cabin, the interlocking logs at the corners created a direct, dense pathway for heat to escape. These corners were thermal highways, constantly bleeding warmth out into the frozen air. Inside, they were the first places to gather a thick white crust of interior frost. The chinking between the logs was another point of failure. No matter how carefully applied, the mix of mud, grass, or moss would shrink and crack in the bone-dry air, opening up dozens of tiny fissures for infiltration. A 20-mile-per-hour wind could force a complete air exchange inside a poorly sealed cabin in under an hour, meaning the occupants were essentially trying to heat the entire state of Nevada. Their neighbors, the Jensens and the Millers, faced the same struggle. They burned through prodigious amounts of wood. A family might consume 4 or 5 cords of pinon and juniper just to keep their living space above freezing. It was a constant, exhausting battle, stoking the fire, feeling a brief wave of radiant heat, only to have the chill creep back in from the walls and floor the moment the flames died down. They were living inside a thermodynamic pump, with the stove desperately trying to pour heat into a container that was leaking from every angle. Iñaki saw their endless labor, the smoke pouring from their chimneys day and night, and knew it was a losing fight. They were fighting the cold head-on. He planned to simply forbid it from entering. The construction began in late September. Iñaki selected 48 straight sound juniper poles, each about 10 feet long. He was not building a solid wall, but a frame, 2 concentric hexagonal lattices, separated by a 14-inch gap. The design was intricate. He lashed the poles together in a series of overlapping scissor courses, creating a structure of immense strength and stability despite its light appearance. There were no vertical posts, No load-bearing corners in the traditional sense. Every pole transferred its load across multiple points, distributing the stress of wind and eventually snow evenly across the entire frame. It resembled a giant, complex basket. Once the double lattice was complete, the truly strange work began. Iñaki brought over the first of many large sacks of fleece from his last shearing. This wasn't the clean, scoured wool Whitmore would buy. It was raw, full of lanolin, burrs, and the dusty smell of the range. He began stuffing it by the handful into the 14-inch cavity between the inner and outer lattice walls. He didn't compress it tightly. He fluffed it, packing it just enough to fill the space without crushing the fibers. His son, Ander, helped, his small hands perfect for pushing the wool into the tighter spots. This was the moment the mockery reached its peak. Garrett Whitmore made a special trip out, his face etched with a kind of pained disbelief. "Iñaki, for the love of God," he said, his voice pleading. "You're creating a perfect environment for pests. It'll collect moisture, it'll rot, and the lanolin will polymerize into a solid grease brick. When you pull that out in the spring, it won't be wool anymore. It'll be felted garbage. I'm telling you, this is economic suicide. You're destroying your only cash crop." Iñaki paused, a great armful of the springy, dark fleece in his hands. He looked at the wool, then at Whitmore. "The lanolin is a virtue," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It is the sheep's oilskin. It sheds water." He offered no further defense. He simply turned and packed the fleece into the wall. Mate watched from the doorway of their old, cold cabin, her expression a mixture of wifely concern and deep-seated trust. "It looks like a wild creature's nest, Iñaki," she said one evening, a small smile playing on her lips. "The wild creatures are warm in winter," he replied, and that was enough for her. For weeks, the pile of wool shrank as the walls of the hexagon grew thick and puffy. He worked his way up, packing the angled roof sections with the same care. Finally, the entire lattice, save for a door opening and a small smoke pipe hole, was encased in a massive, 14-inch thick blanket of raw wool, 400 pounds of it. The final step was to stretch a heavy, oiled canvas over the outer lattice, creating a waterproof, windproof skin. From the outside, it looked like a fat, gray, six-sided tent. It looked temporary, soft, and vulnerable. The mockery lasted through October. The validation would last a lifetime. To understand why Iñaki's wool-stuffed hexagon worked so spectacularly, you have to understand that the problem wasn't the cold itself. The problem was heat transfer. Heat always moves from a warmer area to a colder one, and it does so in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. A log cabin is defeated by all three. Conduction moves heat directly through the solid logs. Convection moves it through air currents, like the cold drafts that sneak through chinking. Radiation moves it as infrared energy, which can pass through the air and be absorbed by colder surfaces. Iñaki's structure was a masterclass in stopping all three, but its true genius lay in its utter annihilation of conduction and convection. The key was the principle of loose fleece dead air bulk. What makes a good insulator? It isn't the material itself, but the air the material traps. Air is a terrible conductor of heat, as long as it can be held still. The goal of insulation is to create as many tiny pockets of motionless air as possible, and nothing in nature does this better than raw wool. Each wool fiber has a natural, microscopic crimp, a series of waves and bends. When thousands of these fibers are loosely packed together, these crimps interlock and create a chaotic, three-dimensional matrix. This matrix traps billions of tiny air pockets. In a cubic foot of Iñaki's insulation, weighing only 1.2 pounds, a staggering 95% of the volume was nothing but still, trapped air. This is what gives loose-fill wool its phenomenal R value, a measure of thermal resistance. A single inch provides an R value of 4. Iñaki had built a wall that was 14 inches thick. A simple calculation reveals the power of his method. 14 inches multiplied by an R value of 4 per inch equals an astonishing R56. For comparison, the 8-inch log walls of his neighbors' cabins had an R value of less than 10. The thickest part of a modern, well-insulated home's wall might be R21. Iñaki had built a super-insulated structure using the most common material he had at hand. The lanolin, which Whitmore saw as a contaminant, was actually a critical part of the system. The natural grease coated every fiber, making it hydrophobic. It repelled liquid water, preventing the wool from becoming saturated and losing its loft. It allowed water vapor, from breathing and cooking, to pass through slowly, keeping the interior dry without letting the insulation get damp. Finally, the hexagonal lattice frame was a structural and thermal masterstroke. Unlike a conventional cabin with its solid, heat-sucking corner posts, the lattice had no single, continuous thermal bridge, from inside to out. Heat trying to escape via conduction would have to travel a long, convoluted path through thin, separated juniper poles. The shape was also inherently strong, perfectly designed to shed the heavy snow loads of a Nevada winter without collapsing. Iñaki hadn't just built a warm shelter, he had built a complete thermal system, elegant and perfectly adapted to its environment. That winter, the Great Basin Cold Dome descended. It was not a storm, but a quiet, oppressive weight of Arctic air that settled over the ranges and refused to move. For 13 consecutive days, the temperature at dawn hovered at or below 28 degrees below zero. The air was so dry and still, it felt like shattered glass in the lungs. Under a brilliant, mercilessly clear sky, the sun had no power. It cast sharp, black shadows, and while a south-facing rock might warm to the touch by midday, any surface and shade remained locked at the ambient air temperature. Cold as coal. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a state of siege. The Jensen's windows were opaque, with a 2-inch layer of frost, not on the outside, but on the inside, formed from the frozen condensation of their own breath. They burned through a cord of wood in a week, the Franklin stove glowing a dull red, yet 10 feet away from it, a cup of water would develop a skin of ice. The Millers ran out of firewood for their main hearth and were forced to huddle in a single room, burning furniture and fence posts to survive. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that seeped through their walls and stole the warmth from their bodies. Inside Iñaki Etzeberia's wool and canvas hexagon, a different reality prevailed. The small sheet metal stove was used sparingly, often just for cooking a morning meal of oatmeal or an evening stew. For hours on end, it would sit cold and silent. The combined body heat of the 4 family members was enough to keep the interior space at a comfortable 65 or 70 degrees. The difference between the inside and outside was a staggering 100 degrees, maintained not by a roaring fire, but by a passive 14-inch wall of greasy wool. The proof of this impossible warmth sat on a low wooden shelf against the inner wall. It was a clay jar filled with pickled lamprey, a delicacy from their Basque homeland. In every other Basque camp for 2 valleys around, similar jars had frozen solid. The brine had crystallized into a pink, solid stone of ice that had to be chipped out with a knife or a horn spoon. But in Iñaki's home, the lamprey floated lazily in their clear, liquid brine, day after day, through the worst of the cold snap. The jar never even developed a hint of frost. This small domestic detail was the ultimate testament. It showed a level of thermal stability that was simply unimaginable to his neighbors. It allowed for normalcy. It allowed Maite to hum as she mended socks, her fingers nimble and warm. It allowed the children to play on the sheepskin floor rugs in their shirt sleeves. It allowed the scent of baking bread to fill the air, not as a desperate act of survival, but as a simple act of home. The cold had been so thoroughly defeated, they had the luxury of forgetting it existed. The cold dome finally broke in late February. By the end of March, the spring thaw had begun, and the range was stirring back to life. It was then that Garrett Whitmore made his way up the muddy track to Inyaki's homestead. He came in the big buyer's wagon, ready to inspect the clip, his face set with the grim expression of a man who knew he was about to deliver bad news. He expected to find a family weary from a hard winter and a pile of ruined wool. As he drew near, he noted the first strange detail. There was no smoke curling from the stovepipe. On a chilly March morning, that was unusual. He pulled the wagon to a stop and walked to the canvas flap that served as a door. He knocked. Iñaki pulled the flap aside. A wave of warm, dry air washed over Whitmore's face, carrying the faint, pleasant scent of lanolin and clean wool. He stared. Iñaki was in his shirt sleeves. Behind him, Maite was sweeping the floor, and the two children were reading a book at a small wooden table, also without coats. The interior was bright, calm, and impossibly warm. Whitmore's eyes went immediately to the small stove in the center of the room. It was cold, gray iron. "Stove's out," Whitmore stated, a note of confusion in his voice. "Been unlit since Candlemas," Iñaki said quietly, referring to the early February holiday. Whitmore was speechless. He stepped inside, his boots making a soft sound on the packed earth floor. He looked around, his brain struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him with a lifetime of experience. This soft-walled structure, this sheep-pelt tent, was more comfortable than the finest board and batten house in Elko. He walked to the wall. He expected to feel a damp chill radiating from it, the telltale sign of condensation and rot. He placed his palm flat against the inner canvas. It felt neutral, almost alive, with no hint of cold or damp. "The wool," Whitmore said, his voice husky. "May I see the wool?" Iñaki nodded and pointed to a small, tied-down flap in the inner wall, designed for just such an inspection. Whitmore's hands, accustomed to judging fleece by touch, fumbled with the knot. He pulled the flap open and reached deep into the 14-inch cavity. His fingers sank into the fleece. He braced himself for the feeling he knew was coming, a cold, greasy, compressed mat, like a sodden blanket. Instead, his fingers met a springy, dry, and astonishingly fluffy mass. He grabbed a large handful and pulled it out into the light. The raw wool exploded in his palm, expanding to 3 times its packed size. The fibers were resilient, the crimp was perfect, and while the scent of lanolin was strong, it was clean. The grease had done exactly what Iñaki said it would. It had protected the fibers, shedding the minute amounts of vapor that passed through, keeping the massive insulation bat perfectly dry and functional. Whitmore stared at the fluffy wool in his hand, then at the comfortable family, then at the jar of lampreys still sitting in their clear, liquid brine. The entire ludicrous structure was not just a success, it was a triumph. His rigid commercial understanding of wool had been completely shattered and replaced by a profound sense of awe. He looked at the Basque shepherd, whose quiet confidence now seemed like towering genius. "My God, man," Whitmore whispered, shaking his head in wonder. "You didn't build a shelter, you built a lung." Garrett Whitmore became Iñaki's most vocal advocate. At the Woolpool auction that spring, he not only paid full price for the Exiberia clip, which he graded as some of the finest, most resilient fleece he had seen, but he also told the story to anyone who would listen. He described the shirt sleeves in March, the unlit stove, the fluffy wool pulled from the wall. Some men listened with interest, others with disbelief, but the story planted a seed. The true spread of the idea, however, happened in a way unique to the Basque community. It traveled not on paper or by wagon, but on the wind. One evening, as the alpenglow painted the peaks of the Rubies, A shepherd, tending his flock on a high ridge, let out an Eusko Irinsi. It was the traditional, high-pitched, ululating cry of the Basque shepherds, a complex yodel used to communicate across miles of rugged, empty country. It was a call of greeting, of warning, of news. Tonight it carried the story of Iñaki Etzeberia's warm winter house. The caller described the hexagonal frame, the two walls of juniper, the space between filled with the flock's own fleece. Miles away, on another ridge, an answer came back, a series of questioning yelps. The first shepherd responded, calling out the dimensions, the thickness of the wool, the canvas skin. The knowledge passed from ridge to ridge, a conversation held across entire valleys, a piece of ancient culture transmitting a radical new idea. By the autumn of 1906, the effect of those calls was visible on the landscape. Across the Ruby Mountains and into the ranges beyond, 3 more wool-stuffed hexagons had appeared, built by other Basque families who had heard the story on the wind and trusted the wisdom of their own. The idea was too simple and too effective to ignore. It required no milled lumber, no special tools, just the poles that could be harvested from any canyon and the fleece that was the very reason for their presence in this harsh land. What Iñaki Etzeberria accomplished on that Nevada range in 1905 was a quiet revolution that anticipated the core principles of modern building science by nearly a century. His hexagonal lattice, with its lack of continuous corner posts, was an intuitive form of a thermal break, a concept now fundamental to high-efficiency construction. The oiled canvas skin, separated from the wool insulation by the outer lattice, created a rain screen, allowing any moisture to drain away before it could compromise the wall system. The entire structure was, in modern parlance, a breathable wall assembly, allowing water vapor to escape while blocking air infiltration. The R56 value he achieved is still considered elite performance today, the kind of number architects and builders strive for in expensive custom-built passive house or net-zero homes. Iñaki built it with juniper, rawhide, and the dirty fleece of his own flock. He created a masterpiece of thermal efficiency, not through formal education, but through a deep, lived understanding of his primary material. In the end, the story of the wool and lattice house is about more than just staying warm. It is about a different way of seeing the world. Garrett Whitmore, a good and knowledgeable man, saw wool as a commodity. He saw it in terms of market value, grade, and weight. His entire frame of reference was economic. When he looked at a fleece, he saw a price per pound. Iñaki Etzeberria saw the wool's true nature. He understood its primary biological purpose: to trap a layer of still air around a living creature, protecting it from the elements. He didn't see a product to be sold. He saw a system to be emulated. He understood that the sheep's greatest gift wasn't the money it brought in the spring, but the life-saving principle it embodied all winter. So he didn't just shelter under the wool in the form of a blanket. He collaborated with it. He honored its intrinsic design. He taught his own clip how to stand up, form a circle around his family, and hold them in a warm, dry embrace through the worst the Great Basin could throw at them. The Nevada frontier was an unforgiving place. It didn't reward tradition or credentials. It rewarded what worked. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of frontier ingenuity. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates clever solutions. And don't forget to answer our question in the comments. What other natural materials have you seen used in ingenious ways for building? We love hearing your stories. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and thermal dynamics. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.